Why does saying no feel like a threat to your survival? Why does one small refusal create so much panic inside people? A delayed reply, a rejected favor, a boundary, a moment of unavailability. Why do these things feel emotionally dangerous even when they are completely reasonable? Because most people were never taught that love could survive disappointment, so they learned something else instead. Compliance became protection. Agreement became safety. Helpfulness became identity. And slowly people began sacrificing themselves piece by piece just to avoid the terrifying possibility of rejection. That is the hidden psychological contract controlling millions of lives right now. If I remain useful, I will remain valued. That sentence silently governs entire personalities. People become emotionally available 24 hours a day, always responding, always helping, always accommodating, always saying yes, even while resentment quietly accumulates underneath. And modern culture rewards this behavior aggressively, especially in hyper-connected life where availability became confused with virtue. If you are constantly reachable, you are considered caring. If you sacrifice your time endlessly, you are considered good. If you never inconvenience anyone, you are considered mature. But beneath this performance often exists something much darker: fear. Fear of disappointing people, fear of conflict, fear of abandonment, fear that saying no once might expose how replaceable you really feel internally. So people overextend themselves constantly, not from generosity alone, from anxiety. And anxiety disguised as kindness becomes self-destruction eventually. You can see this everywhere now. People replying instantly while emotionally exhausted. Accepting responsibilities they secretly dread. Giving time they cannot afford. Listening endlessly while nobody listens back. Trying to earn belonging through usefulness because they secretly fear they have no value outside of what they provide. That fear changes personality completely. You stop asking, "What do I actually need?" and begin asking, "What response will keep everyone comfortable with me?" That question quietly ruins lives, because eventually your entire identity becomes organized around preventing rejection rather than pursuing truth. And this starts early, very early. Children quickly learn which behaviors earn approval. Be helpful, be quiet, be easy. Do not create problems. Do not upset people. Do not be difficult. And children who receive love conditionally often become adults terrified of boundaries, because boundaries risk emotional disconnection. So they adapt, become hyper-aware of other people's emotions, hyper-responsible for maintaining harmony, hyper-attentive to social tension. They learn to manage everyone else's comfort while abandoning their own internally. People praise this behavior constantly. You're so selfless, so dependable, so kind. But often beneath extreme helpfulness exists an exhausted nervous system terrified of rejection. That is the psychological trap. The world rewards your self-neglect while quietly consuming you through it. And technology amplified this problem beyond anything previous generations experienced. Now people are reachable constantly. No natural separation exists anymore. Work enters bedrooms. Notifications enter silence. People expect immediate emotional access to you at all times, and every ignored message creates subtle guilt. Every delayed response creates anxiety. The nervous system never fully rests because availability became socially mandatory. You are expected to remain emotionally open endlessly, and people call this connection. But endless accessibility destroys psychological boundaries slowly. You stop belonging to yourself. Your time stops feeling like your own. Your attention becomes public property. And eventually, exhaustion becomes your baseline emotional state. Yet even then many people still cannot say no, because the fear underneath remains stronger than the exhaustion. The fear of being disliked, the fear of seeming selfish, the fear that one refusal might collapse their social worth entirely. That fear sounds irrational logically, but emotionally it feels real, very real, because humans are social creatures. Rejection historically threatened survival itself. Isolation once meant death, so the nervous system still interprets social disapproval as danger even in modern environments. That is why boundaries feel physically uncomfortable sometimes. Heart racing, anxiety rising, guilt appearing instantly. The body reacts as though honesty itself is unsafe, and many people spend their entire lives avoiding this discomfort completely. They choose temporary peace over personal integrity repeatedly. Say yes instead of risking tension. Stay silent instead of risking disapproval. Comply instead of risking abandonment. But every dishonest yes creates internal damage. Every forced agreement teaches the nervous system, my needs matter less than preserving approval. Repeat that pattern long enough, and self-respect begins disappearing quietly. That is the real tragedy, not exhaustion. Disconnection from yourself. Because people who cannot say no eventually stop knowing what they genuinely want anymore. Their life becomes reactive, managed by requests, expectations, demands, other people's emergencies becoming their permanent emotional environment. And slowly resentment begins growing beneath the surface. Not because they are cruel, because human beings cannot survive endless self-abandonment without consequences. That resentment leaks everywhere eventually. Burnout, emotional numbness, passive aggression, quiet bitterness, exhaustion mistaken for depression. All because nobody taught them that boundaries are not cruelty. They are identity. A person without boundaries slowly dissolves psychologically. And perhaps the deepest truth is this: people who truly care about you do not require your self-destruction as proof of love. Only people benefiting from your lack of boundaries punish you for developing them. That realization changes everything. Because suddenly the problem is no longer, how do I make everyone happy? The question becomes, why am I so afraid of disappointing people that I keep abandoning myself? And that question leads directly into the deeper machinery underneath all compliance. The machinery built from fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of worthlessness. Fear that if you stop being endlessly useful, nobody will choose you willingly anymore. The virtue trap. One of the most dangerous lies modern society ever created is this: self-neglect is noble. The more exhausted you are for others, the more virtuous you appear. And people absorb this conditioning so deeply that they begin confusing burnout with goodness. You can see it everywhere now. People bragging about how busy they are, how unavailable they are to themselves, how much they sacrifice, how little they sleep, how many people depend on them. Exhaustion became social proof, a badge of moral importance. And the hyper-connected world of 2026 made this even worse, because now your usefulness is constantly visible, always online, always reachable, always productive, always emotionally available. Technology erased the natural boundaries human beings once had. Work follows you home. Messages follow you into silence. People expect immediate access to your attention like your nervous system is public infrastructure. And if you resist, you feel guilty instantly. That guilt matters deeply, because guilt is how the virtue trap maintains control. People no longer help purely because they want to. They help because refusal threatens their identity. The good person, the dependable one, the selfless friend, the always available partner. These labels become emotional prisons. Because once your identity depends on being needed, you become terrified of disappointing anyone. That fear slowly reshapes behavior completely. You start over-explaining boundaries, apologizing for rest, feeling selfish for protecting your own time. Even basic self-care begins feeling morally suspicious. And beneath all this performance hides a painful truth most people avoid confronting. The helper identity is often camouflage. Camouflage for fear. Fear of being seen as selfish. Fear of becoming unnecessary. fear of not being lovable unless constantly useful. That realization unsettles people deeply, because helping others sounds morally pure externally, and sometimes it genuinely is. But many people are not helping from emotional abundance. They are helping from emotional survival. There is a difference. One comes from choice. The other comes from fear. Fear says, if I stop giving, people may stop valuing me. That fear creates compulsive availability. People answer messages while emotionally drained, agree to plans they dread internally, accept extra responsibilities despite already drowning mentally, not because they truly want to, because disappointing people feels psychologically unbearable. So they keep saying yes, even while resentment quietly accumulates underneath. And resentment is important here, because resentment often reveals where self-betrayal has been happening repeatedly. Healthy generosity rarely creates deep resentment. Forced generosity does. When you continuously override your own needs to maintain approval, the nervous system notices. Even if your conscious mind keeps pretending everything is fine. That internal conflict creates exhaustion, unlike normal tiredness. Not physical exhaustion, identity exhaustion. The exhaustion of constantly suppressing your truth to preserve your image. And modern culture rewards this suppression aggressively. Especially online. People receive praise for endless availability, for self-sacrifice, for emotional labor, for being there for everyone. But almost nobody asks an important question: who is there for the person constantly carrying everyone else? Because the helper often becomes emotionally invisible. People stop seeing them as human beings with limits. They become support systems, emotional infrastructure, a reliable resource others unconsciously consume. And the helper allows this because usefulness became tied to self-worth. That is the tragedy. The person slowly disappears beneath the role. You stop existing as an individual with needs. You become function, service, utility, and the scariest part is how socially rewarded this becomes. The world applauds people while draining them completely, especially sensitive people, empathetic people, conscientious people. They often become trapped in endless emotional responsibility for everyone around them. Not because anyone formally assigned them that role, because they unconsciously volunteered for it, trying to earn security through usefulness, trying to avoid rejection through compliance, trying to guarantee belonging through sacrifice. But belonging purchased through self-erasure is unstable by nature, because eventually exhaustion exposes the truth. You cannot endlessly abandon yourself without psychological consequences. The body keeps score, the mind keeps score, the nervous system keeps score, and over time anxiety begins replacing peace entirely. Because when your self-worth depends on external approval, your emotional stability becomes externally controlled too. Every interaction starts carrying invisible pressure. Did I respond fast enough? Did I disappoint them? Do they think I am rude now? Are they upset with me? This hypervigilance destroys inner calm slowly. You become emotionally overclocked, always monitoring people's reactions, always scanning for signs of rejection, always managing perceptions. That is not kindness anymore. That is survival behavior. And survival behavior eventually consumes identity completely. Because people trapped in the virtue trap lose connection with authentic desire. They become so focused on managing others emotionally that they stop listening to themselves internally. What do I actually want? What am I genuinely comfortable with? What boundaries feel necessary for my well-being? These questions disappear beneath obligation. And obligation becomes endless once people learn you struggle to say no. This is another brutal truth. People adapt to your lack of boundaries quickly, not always maliciously. Human beings naturally move toward accessible resources, and someone who constantly sacrifices themselves becomes emotionally easy to consume. Others begin expecting availability automatically, expecting accommodation automatically, expecting emotional labor automatically. Not because they consciously hate you, because you trained them. That realization hurts, but it is necessary. Every forced yes teaches people your limits are flexible. Every moment of self-abandonment teaches others your time belongs to them more than to you. And slowly, your life becomes overcrowded with obligations that never truly belong to you. That is why the virtue trap is so dangerous. It disguises fear as morality, makes self-erasure appear noble, makes boundaries appear selfish, makes exhaustion appear meaningful. But exhaustion is not proof of goodness. Burnout is not evidence of love, and endless availability is not the same thing as genuine compassion. True compassion includes yourself too. That is the part many people were never taught. They learned how to care for everyone except themselves. And eventually, they begin disappearing emotionally beneath the weight of everyone else's expectations. That disappearance happens quietly. No dramatic collapse initially, just subtle numbness, subtle resentment, subtle exhaustion. Until one day they realize something terrifying. They built an entire identity around being needed, but never learned how to exist without constantly proving their worth to others. The high price of safety. Most people do not stay silent because they are weak. They stay silent because silence once protected them. That is the uncomfortable truth hidden beneath chronic people-pleasing. At some point, the nervous system learned a dangerous equation. Conflict equals danger. Disappointment equals rejection. Rejection equals abandonment, so silence became survival. Agreement became armor. Compliance became the fastest way to escape emotional discomfort. And the body remembers this even when the mind knows better logically. That is why saying no can feel physically terrifying. Not metaphorically, physically. The chest tightens, the stomach sinks, the heart races, adrenaline rises, because the nervous system interprets social tension as threat. Especially for people who grew up in emotionally unpredictable environments. Homes where love became conditional. Homes where disagreement triggered punishment. Homes where peace depended on staying easy, useful, quiet, agreeable. Children adapt quickly inside these environments. They become emotionally strategic, reading moods constantly, avoiding friction constantly, trying to prevent conflict before it even begins. And eventually, this survival strategy follows them into adulthood. Except now the danger is gone, but the nervous system still reacts like survival is at stake. That is why many people choose temporary peace over personal integrity repeatedly. Because temporary peace feels safer immediately. You say yes, the tension disappears, the guilt disappears, the discomfort disappears, and the nervous system receives instant relief. That relief becomes addictive, not because compliance feels good, because it removes anxiety temporarily. But temporary relief creates long-term damage. Every dishonest yes creates internal conflict. The body knows when the mouth betrayed the truth. And carrying that contradiction repeatedly creates stress far deeper than ordinary exhaustion. Because human beings are not designed to live divided against themselves constantly. One part wanting rest, another part performing availability, one part needing space, another part forcing agreement, one part screaming internally while the mouth says, "Sure, no problem." That split fractures people psychologically over time, and the nervous system pays the price. Modern neuroscience shows something powerful. Suppressing authentic emotional responses increases physiological stress dramatically. The body enters heightened alert states. Cortisol rises. Emotional exhaustion accumulates. The nervous system remains activated because internal truth and external behavior no longer match. That mismatch matters deeply because integrity is not just moral, it is biological. The body craves congruence, craves alignment between internal reality and external expression. Without that alignment, people slowly become chronically anxious without understanding why. Because the anxiety is not random. It is accumulated self-betrayal. Tiny moments repeated thousands of times. Saying yes while exhausted, laughing while hurt, agreeing while resentful, remaining silent while uncomfortable. And every act teaches the nervous system something dangerous. Your comfort matters less than keeping everyone else comfortable. That belief becomes identity eventually. You stop prioritizing yourself automatically. Stop defending your time automatically. Stop protecting your energy automatically. And people begin consuming your availability endlessly because you train them to expect access without resistance. This part is difficult to hear, but necessary. Many people unconsciously participate in their own exploitation, not because they deserve mistreatment, because fear trained them into over-accessibility, open-ended availability, instant responses, constant accommodation, over-explaining boundaries, apologizing for basic needs. These behaviors signal something subconsciously to others. My limits are negotiable. And human beings adapt quickly to accessible patterns. Coworkers begin relying on you excessively. Friends begin expecting emotional labor constantly. Family members begin assuming your time belongs to them automatically. Again, not always from cruelty, from conditioning. The world responds to the boundaries you consistently reinforce or fail to reinforce. That is why self-neglect becomes self-perpetuating. The more you sacrifice yourself to avoid discomfort, the more discomfort eventually surrounds your life. Because people rarely stop taking what is freely offered without limits, especially in a culture built around convenience and instant access. And technology intensified this dynamic catastrophically. There is no recovery space anymore, no emotional distance, no natural silence. Everyone can reach you instantly, anywhere, anytime. And every ignored notification creates subtle psychological pressure. Modern people are carrying hundreds of invisible social obligations constantly. Unread messages, unanswered requests, pending expectations, tiny emotional debts accumulating endlessly inside the nervous system. No wonder people feel exhausted now. Their mind never fully exits social performance mode. And many secretly believe this exhaustion is normal adulthood. It is not. It is chronic hypervigilance disguised as responsibility. The nervous system remains alert constantly because availability became tied to worthiness. If I respond quickly, I matter. If I help enough, I belong. If I stay useful, I remain loved. That belief quietly destroys people because it creates conditional self-worth. Your value becomes dependent on output for others, and once self-worth becomes externally transactional, rest starts feeling dangerous. Boundaries start feeling selfish. Silence starts feeling irresponsible. Even recovery creates guilt. People apologize for needing space. Apologize for not responding immediately. Apologize for existing outside constant service to others. That is how deeply the conditioning reaches. And the tragic irony is this: the more people fear rejection, the more they attract relationships built around their lack of boundaries. Because healthy people respect limits naturally. Manipulative or emotionally dependent people resist them. So if your entire life revolves around avoiding discomfort, you unconsciously create environments where your discomfort never ends. That is the hidden price of safety. You avoid one moment of tension and inherit years of quiet resentment afterward. You avoid disappointing someone briefly and disappoint yourself continuously instead. You avoid rejection externally while internally rejecting your own needs over and over again. Eventually something collapses, usually slowly. Burnout, emotional numbness, quiet rage, a strange emptiness where identity used to exist. Because people who live entirely for external peace eventually lose internal peace completely. That is why boundaries matter beyond productivity or self-help language. Boundaries are nervous system protection, psychological oxygen. Without them, the self suffocates slowly beneath obligation. And perhaps the hardest realization comes next. Many people are not actually afraid of saying no. They are afraid of discovering which relationships only survive when they abandon themselves. Architects of our own exhaustion. The modern world did not force exhaustion onto people entirely. Many people helped build the prison themselves. That is the painful part, not intentionally, not consciously, but through thousands of tiny behaviors repeated daily. Answering immediately, volunteering automatically, remaining available constantly, offering help before anyone even asks, saying, "I'll handle it," while already overwhelmed. People become architects of their own exhaustion, one small act at a time. And modern culture encourages this aggressively. Especially in hyper-connected environments where availability is treated like professionalism and overwork is treated like character. Open-door policies, instant messaging, 24-hour accessibility. Everyone expected to remain emotionally and mentally reachable forever. No real separation exists anymore between work and recovery, between social connection and emotional invasion. The phone became a portable demand system, and people rarely question this deeply enough, because constant accessibility became normalized. If someone messages you, you should answer. If someone needs help, you should provide it. If someone asks for your time, you should rearrange your life to accommodate them. That pressure exists everywhere now, socially, professionally, digitally, and people comply automatically because they fear the consequences of resistance. But something darker hides beneath this behavior too. Many people volunteer for tasks, not because they genuinely want to help, but because usefulness became their strategy for belonging. That realization changes everything. Think about how often people overcommit themselves emotionally just to feel valuable, taking extra work, solving everyone's problems, becoming the reliable one, the emotionally available one, the fixer, the dependable friend, the family caretaker, the workplace savior. Why? Because usefulness creates temporary emotional security. If people need you, they might not leave you. That belief drives enormous amounts of self-destruction quietly. People buy their right to belong through labor, emotional labor, mental labor, physical labor. They become indispensable, hoping indispensability will protect them from abandonment. But this strategy creates a devastating trap. Because the more you attach your value to usefulness, the more terrified you become of disappointing anyone. And once fear controls your boundaries, exhaustion becomes inevitable. You can watch this happen in real time. Someone exhausted says yes anyway. Someone overwhelmed volunteers again. Someone emotionally drained keeps listening endlessly because silence feels selfish. The nervous system becomes trapped in permanent output mode, always producing, always helping, always giving. And eventually the person disappears beneath the role they created. This is why so many people feel strangely hollow despite being surrounded by responsibilities. They no longer exist as human beings internally, only as functions. What can I solve? Who needs me? What task requires my energy now? Their identity revolves entirely around service. And service without boundaries eventually becomes self-erasure. Especially because modern society rarely rewards restraint. It rewards overextension. The employee who always says yes. The friend always available. The person constantly sacrificing themselves for everyone else. At first, these people receive praise, recognition, approval, but eventually something shifts. The extra effort becomes expected, not appreciated, expected. That is how exploitation often begins. Quietly, gradually. People adjust to your overgiving until your self-sacrifice feels normal to them. And once behavior becomes normalized, appreciation fades while expectations remain. This creates deep resentment internally, not because helping others is wrong, because the giving stopped being voluntary emotionally. It became compulsory, driven by fear instead of generosity. That distinction matters enormously. Healthy giving contains freedom, Compulsive giving contains anxiety, and anxiety-based helpfulness slowly destroys the nervous system, because anxious people do not know how to rest fully. Even during rest, they remain psychologically alert, checking phones, monitoring messages, anticipating demands, preparing responses. The mind never fully exits service mode. That chronic vigilance creates emotional exhaustion far beyond physical tiredness, and eventually people begin losing connection with desire itself. What do I want? What do I enjoy? What pace feels healthy for me? These questions disappear because life becomes entirely reactive. Other people's schedules, other people's emergencies, other people's expectations. The self becomes secondary, always secondary. And perhaps the saddest part is this: many people secretly believe this is what love looks like. Total access, total availability, total sacrifice. But relationships requiring your constant depletion are not healthy connections. They are unsustainable emotional arrangements. Real connection leaves space for individuality, for limits, for recovery, for separate existence. But people trapped in self-worth through service struggle deeply with this idea, because boundaries threaten identity itself. If I stop overgiving, who am I? If I stop solving everyone's problems, will people still choose me? That fear keeps the cycle spinning endlessly. People exhaust themselves trying to secure belonging externally while becoming increasingly disconnected internally. And the body notices. The body always notices. Chronic fatigue, brain fog, irritability, anxiety, emotional numbness, a strange resentment toward people you supposedly care about. These are often symptoms of invisible self-abandonment repeated too long. The nervous system cannot sustain endless self-neglect without consequences. Eventually, something breaks, and modern culture mislabels this collapse constantly. Burnout, stress, overwhelm. But underneath many cases exists something deeper, a person who never learned they were allowed to exist without constantly earning their right to take up space. That wound creates endless overfunctioning, endless proving, endless sacrificing, because deep down they believe rest must be deserved, boundaries must be justified, and worth must be continuously earned through usefulness. That belief is poison, because human beings are not machines designed for infinite extraction. They require limits, recovery, autonomy, private emotional space. And yet so many people feel guilty for even wanting these things. Why? Because somewhere along the way they learned this terrifying lesson: my value decreases the moment I stop being useful. That is the core fear keeping the entire system alive. Not kindness, not generosity. Fear that without endless giving, they might finally discover how little they believe they deserve love without performance. The terror of refusal. For many people, saying no does not feel like a simple decision. It feels catastrophic, as if one refusal might trigger complete social collapse. One boundary, one disagreement, one moment of unavailability. And suddenly the nervous system reacts like everything is at risk. Respect, belonging, love, value, safety. That reaction seems irrational from the outside, but internally it feels terrifyingly real, because many people unconsciously believe their social worth is fragile, conditional, temporary, dependent on usefulness. So refusal becomes emotionally dangerous. Not because saying no is wrong, because they fear what the no might reveal. What if they stop liking me? What if they think I'm selfish? What if they leave? What if I disappoint them and never recover socially? That fear controls countless lives silently. People stay in exhausting relationships because of it. Stay overcommitted because of it. Stay emotionally available long after depletion because of it. All to avoid one uncomfortable possibility: disapproval. And modern culture intensified this fear dramatically. Because today rejection no longer feels private. Everything became socially visible. People fear exclusion constantly, being left out, ignored, misunderstood, cancelled, judged, disconnected, The human nervous system was never built for this level of continuous social exposure. So people adapt the only way they know how: compliance. If I remain agreeable, I remain safe. If I stay useful, I remain accepted. If I avoid friction, I avoid abandonment. That becomes the subconscious strategy. And eventually compliance stops feeling like a choice. It becomes reflex, automatic. Someone asks for something. You say yes before even checking how you feel internally. Someone crosses a boundary. You laugh it off instead of addressing it. Someone drains your energy repeatedly. You tolerate it because confrontation feels worse than exhaustion. This is where compliance becomes weaponized psychologically, not by others first, by ourselves. People use compliance to bypass discomfort instantly. Saying yes becomes emotional anesthesia, temporary relief from guilt, temporary relief from anxiety, temporary relief from confrontation. But every avoided boundary creates a larger problem later, because unspoken resentment compounds silently. The body remembers every moment you abandoned yourself, every forced smile, every fake agreement, every exhausted yes, and eventually emotional debt accumulates beyond what the nervous system can carry comfortably. That is why many people feel chronically tense around others now, because social interaction stopped feeling authentic. It became strategic, a constant attempt to manage perception while suppressing internal truth. That suppression creates exhaustion, not just emotionally, neurologically. The brain enters conflict states whenever authentic impulses are repeatedly overridden for social preservation. One part says, I need space. Another says, but what if they get upset? One part says, I cannot handle this right now. Another says, but good people help. That internal war creates psychological fragmentation. And fragmented people become easy to manipulate, because someone terrified of rejection becomes highly controllable. All you must do is imply disappointment, withdraw approval, create guilt. Suddenly they abandon their own needs automatically. This dynamic appears everywhere. Families, friendships, workplaces, relationships. Entire systems quietly depend on people struggling to say no. Why? Because boundaries interrupt extraction. A person capable of refusal becomes harder to overwork, harder to emotionally consume, harder to pressure socially. That is why learning to say no feels revolutionary internally. You are not merely rejecting a request. You are confronting years of conditioning, years of fear, years of subconscious beliefs linking approval to survival. That confrontation feels brutal initially, especially because the first few boundaries often trigger guilt immediately. Intense guilt, sometimes panic. The nervous system interprets refusal as danger because historically your identity depended on compliance. So when you finally say no, the body reacts like betrayal occurred. But something important must be understood. Guilt is not always evidence that you did something wrong. Sometimes guilt is evidence that you violated old conditioning. That distinction changes everything, because people trapped in chronic compliance often confuse discomfort with immorality. If setting a boundary feels uncomfortable, they assume it must be selfish. But boundaries are uncomfortable precisely because they disrupt patterns, especially patterns benefiting other people. And this reveals another painful truth. Some relationships survive only while you remain convenient. The moment you become less available, less accommodating, less endlessly useful, the relationship changes. That realization hurts deeply, but it also exposes reality. People who truly value you will adapt to your boundaries eventually. People benefiting primarily from your lack of boundaries will resist them aggressively. That resistance often creates confusion, because compliant people expect understanding when they finally protect themselves. Instead, they sometimes encounter anger, distance, passive aggression, guilt manipulation. Why? because boundaries change power dynamics, and not everyone benefits equally from healthier dynamics. This is why learning refusal requires emotional courage, not aggression. Courage, the courage to tolerate misunderstanding temporarily. The courage to survive disappointment. The courage to let people feel emotions without rushing to rescue them from discomfort. That last part is especially important. Many people overfunction emotionally because they cannot tolerate others being upset with them. So they fix, accommodate, appease, over-explain, all to restore harmony quickly. But harmony purchased through self-betrayal is psychologically expensive. Real peace requires honesty, and honesty includes refusal sometimes. No, I cannot do that. No, I need rest. No, that does not work for me. No, I am unavailable. Simple sentences. Yet for many people, these sentences feel almost impossible initially, because refusal threatens the entire identity structure they built around being needed. But eventually a deeper realization emerges. A life without refusal is not kindness. It is captivity. Because without the ability to say no, your yes loses meaning too. If people can access your time, energy, and attention endlessly without resistance, then your generosity stops being a gift. It becomes expectation. And expectation slowly kills authentic connection. Why? Because authentic relationships require truth, not endless accommodation. Truth. The truth of limits. The truth of individuality. The truth that human beings cannot remain emotionally available infinitely without disappearing internally. That is why refusal matters beyond productivity or self-care language. Refusal protects identity. Refusal protects integrity. Refusal protects the nervous system from becoming public property. And perhaps the greatest transformation happens here. You stop viewing boundaries as rejection of others and begin understanding them as protection of your relationship with yourself. Because every honest no sends a powerful message internally. My needs matter too. For someone who spent years abandoning themselves to maintain approval, that realization feels almost revolutionary. Not cruel, not selfish. Liberating, dismantling the machinery. The hardest part about reclaiming your life is realizing the machinery was never entirely outside of you. It lives internally now. In habits, reflexes, automatic guilt, the instinct to apologize for existing with limits, the fear that rest must be earned, the belief that your value depends on how useful you remain to everyone around you. That machinery runs quietly in the background of daily life, and unless you dismantle it consciously, it will continue controlling your decisions long after you recognize the pattern intellectually. Awareness alone is not enough. Many people already know they overextend themselves, already know they struggle with boundaries, already know they are exhausted, yet they continue saying yes automatically. Why? Because the nervous system still associates self-sacrifice with safety. So dismantling the machinery requires retraining identity itself, not just behavior, identity. You must stop viewing yourself primarily as a function for others, a resource, a support system, a constantly available emotional service, and begin seeing yourself as a human being whose time, energy, and attention possess intrinsic value independent of usefulness. That shift sounds simple. It is not. Especially for people who built their self-worth around productivity for others. Helping, fixing, managing, supporting, performing. When usefulness becomes identity, rest feels threatening. Because stillness forces a terrifying question. If I stop producing value for everyone else, who am I? That question sits underneath enormous amounts of modern anxiety. People stay busy partly to avoid confronting it, but eventually the cycle becomes unbearable. The exhaustion grows too heavy, the resentment grows too loud, and something inside begins demanding change. That is where rebuilding starts, quietly, with small acts that initially feel uncomfortable, delayed responses, shorter explanations, Protecting time without excessive guilt. Saying, "I can't," without writing a 5-paragraph apology afterward. That last part matters more than people realize. Over-explaining is often fear disguised as politeness. Fear that your boundary requires permission to exist. But healthy boundaries do not require courtroom defense strategies. No is a complete sentence. And learning to tolerate the discomfort afterward becomes essential, because the discomfort will come. At first, your nervous system may panic, you may feel selfish. Cold, cruel, the machinery will fight to survive. Old conditioning always does. But you must learn something revolutionary. Discomfort is not danger. Someone being disappointed in you is not an emergency. Someone misunderstanding your boundary is not proof you are bad. People are allowed to feel things without you collapsing to fix it immediately. That realization changes relationships completely, because compliant people often mistake emotional management for love. They think keeping everyone comfortable is their responsibility. But constantly regulating other people's emotions destroys your own nervous system eventually. So the machinery must be interrupted repeatedly, not dramatically, consistently. You practice honest friction. That is the phrase most people avoid entirely. Honest friction. The willingness to allow small moments of tension in order to preserve long-term authenticity. Because real relationships are not built through endless accommodation. They are built through truth surviving tension. Think about that carefully. If a relationship only functions while you suppress your needs completely, was it truly connection, or was it access? That distinction matters deeply. Authentic relationships can survive boundaries, can survive disagreement, can survive temporary disappointment. Performative relationships collapse the moment convenience disappears, and honest friction exposes this quickly. The first time you say no, the first time you become less available, the first time you stop over-functioning emotionally, you begin seeing people clearly. Some adapt respectfully, some guilt-trip you, some distance themselves entirely. Painful, but necessary, because boundaries are filters. They reveal who values your humanity and who values your usefulness. And this filtering process is emotionally difficult for chronic people-pleasers, because they often built wide social circles through overgiving, through constant emotional labor, through endless availability. Once boundaries appear, certain dynamics naturally disappear too. That loss can feel lonely initially, but loneliness built from honesty heals faster than connection built from self-erasure. Always. And slowly something beautiful begins happening internally. Space returns, mental space, emotional space. Silence returns to the nervous system. You stop living in permanent reaction mode. Stop checking messages compulsively. Stop feeling responsible for everyone's emotional stability constantly. And in that silence, you begin hearing yourself again. Your actual preferences, your actual energy limits, your actual desires. People who spent years over-accommodating others often discover something shocking here. They barely know themselves anymore, because their entire identity revolved around external management. Other people's moods, other people's expectations, other people's emergencies. But now attention turns inward again, and inward attention changes everything. You start asking healthier questions. What genuinely drains me? What relationships feel reciprocal? What environments require performance instead of authenticity? What pace of life actually feels sustainable for my nervous system? These questions rebuild identity from the inside outward. And perhaps most importantly, you begin decoupling self-worth from productivity. That may be the hardest step of all, because modern society worships usefulness obsessively. People are praised for overworking, overhelping, overproducing. Even self-care gets transformed into optimization eventually. But your worth was never meant to be measured entirely through output. You are not valuable only when exhausted, not valuable only when needed, not valuable only when sacrificing yourself endlessly. Human beings possess worth beyond utility, deep, intrinsic worth, and people disconnected from this truth spend their entire lives trying to earn what should never have required earning in the first place. Love, respect, belonging, the machinery convinces you these things must be purchased through performance. But real connection cannot be purchased. Only performed connection can. Real connection requires honesty, and honesty requires the presence of a respected no. Not a cruel no, not a defensive no, a grounded no, a calm no, a self-respecting no. Because without the ability to refuse, you cannot truly choose either. And choice is what transforms service into generosity. Without choice, giving becomes obligation. Without choice, kindness becomes fear. Without choice, relationships become emotional contracts built around self-abandonment. That is why dismantling the machinery matters so deeply. You are not merely learning boundaries. You are reclaiming ownership over your life, your time, your energy, your nervous system, your identity. And maybe for the first time, you begin understanding something profound. The people truly meant for your life will not require your exhaustion as proof that you care.